Hey there! Thanks for listening to the INFEMIT podcast, where we want to challenge the people of God to see the realities of their context and reflect on and reformulate concepts such as mission, missionary, mission field, holistic mission, and more.
Hi friends, I'm Tori Greaves, the Director of Operations for the International Fellowship for Missionist Transformation. I'm here today with Brooke Prentis. Brooke is an Aboriginal Christian leader from the Waka Waka peoples. Earlier in 2020, Brooke became the CEO of Common Grace, a movement of people pursuing Jesus and justice rooted in the lands now called Australia. Brooke is a founding member of NAITS Australia and is currently studying a Master of Theology through NAITS, an Indigenous learning community. She's a scholar at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. Brooke joined INFEMIT this year as a networking team member, connecting INFEMIT to others like herself and Common Grace in the South Pacific who are eager to see the church living out a holistic understanding of mission. Hi, Brooke. Thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Hi, Tori. Thanks so much for having me.
We're doing a series of podcasts in order to reflect on the implications of COVID-19 for mission and theology, and I'm really excited to hear from you. But before we dig in, I wanted to hear a little bit more about yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, I can. So my name is Brooke Prentis. I'm an Aboriginal Christian leader, and my peoples are the Waka Waka peoples. And Waka Waka Nation is one of the over 300 nations of Aboriginal peoples in these lands now called Australia. And so for us here in these lands now called Australia, our Indigenous peoples, we have Aboriginal peoples and also Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I'm an Aboriginal person, and Waka Waka Nation is my grandmother's country. But I grew up on Gubbi Gubbi country, which is a neighbouring nation to Waka Waka Nation. But I'm now living on Gadigal Nation, and this is when you start to see the over 300 nations of Aboriginal peoples in these lands now called Australia. And Gadigal country is in the place now called Sydney, with which most people are probably more familiar with. And I now have the privilege of serving as the CEO of Common Grace. I'm actually a chartered accountant by profession, one of only 22 Indigenous chartered accountants in all of Australia, but obviously now keenly involved in theology. And we've got a long way to go in these lands now called Australia in recognising, honouring and listening to Indigenous theologians. So I'm so thankful to be part of the INFEMIT network as well, to come together across the world.
That's great. Thanks so much, Brooke. And to get a better understanding of what COVID's actually looked like for you in your context, can you share a little bit about how it's affected your lives and the lives of others around you in the lands now called Australia?
Yes, it's been the way I describe it is an interesting time. So I mentioned before I'm an Aboriginal Christian leader and as the CEO of Common Grace. And so Common Grace is a movement of people pursuing Jesus and justice. And that's not just Indigenous peoples, that's all peoples of all cultures and right across the different church backgrounds and denominations and theological views as well. And so, but at the centre of Common Grace's work is that pursuit of Jesus and justice. And so being an Aboriginal Christian leader, so that started in 2012 when I left accounting to go and be an Aboriginal pastor. But I guess as Aboriginal peoples, we very much have the lived reality of injustice each and every day. And for us, those impacts of colonisation really commenced here in these lands now called Australia 250 years ago. This year, 2020, is actually the 250-year anniversary of the arrival of the Europeans, well, specifically of Lieutenant James Cook to right here in Sydney, which has set our people on a very huge path, I guess, of destruction and death and disease. And it's not just our peoples, it's what we call country. And I think I've already used the word country, but country for us, we're appointed by the Creator as the Creator's custodians to care for country. And country is all lands, waters, sky, trees, plants, animals, birds, fish, mountains, rocks, and then all peoples. And so this year 2020, where the world has faced a global pandemic, but we also face a global climate crisis. And here in these lands now called Australia, Aboriginal peoples are black peoples. We are the black peoples of these lands now called Australia. So we also are more aware of a global Black Lives Matter movement. And for us, our key justice issue is Aboriginal deaths in custody. COVID-19 doesn't really change those injustices for Aboriginal peoples. It highlights and accentuates them. And we have a thing called closing the gap. We, as Indigenous peoples of these lands now called Australia, have the world's worst life expectancy of any Indigenous peoples in the world. So we die on average 11 to 17 years younger than the non-Indigenous population of Australia. And so those things don't change through a global pandemic. And I've heard many peoples, particularly non-Indigenous peoples, refer to COVID-19 and the year 2020 as turbulent, disrupted, waiting for the new normal. What is the new normal? And what I say is that, well, we've been living through 250 years of turbulence and disruption and waiting for that new normal. And so I think COVID-19 for us as Aboriginal peoples has, and particularly Aboriginal Christians, I guess some injustices have been heightened and more people are aware of them, but we've still got a long way to go. Thankfully, we haven't, as Aboriginal peoples, been that affected by COVID-19, which is miraculous, because with those poor health statistics, if COVID had come to our communities, there would have been complete destruction. And so it is an interesting time, and Australia is made up of several states and territories, and between those states and territories, there have been border closures, which is the first time for non-Indigenous peoples that they've had to face these things, faced restrictions on their freedoms and their rights. But for us as Aboriginal peoples, we've always lived through this, and still the lived injustice and the lack of respect of our human rights. Australia constantly breaks the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And then for Aboriginal children, Australia constantly breaks the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child. In Australia, we lock up 10-year-old children, and they're predominantly Aboriginal children in our prisons in Australia. And so, one of the aspects of COVID-19, there was a non-Indigenous prison guard in a youth detention centre that got COVID, and the detention centre has been in lockdown. These are 10-year-old children in there, Aboriginal children, and basically put in solitary confinement, not allowed any visitors. And most of Australia still hasn't woken up to that, let alone the rest of the world. And sometimes we are appealing to the rest of the world to actually understand the level of injustice that Aboriginal peoples face in these lands now called Australia. Both the past but the present day injustices. And so that's when I talk about the border closures. It was right up until 1967. Aboriginal people were not allowed to move freely. We had to get a permit, a piece of paper, to be able to move freely. And so the rest of Australia doesn't seem to understand that or know that history. And then obviously, as we look at disease and global pandemic, many non-Indigenous people feel like it's the first time. We often talk about intergenerational trauma that Indigenous peoples have through the impacts of colonisation. But on the other side of that is the intergenerational memory. And so when the Europeans brought smallpox to Australia, that did cause much death to Aboriginal peoples, we remember that. We remember the Spanish flu when many of our people were still, restricted on reserves and missions under horrific conditions. These are not that long ago, and we remember. And so I think there's lots that the rest of Australia can still learn from Aboriginal peoples, but the rest of the world as well, from Aboriginal peoples of these lands now called Australia, is the world's oldest living continuing cultures, but Indigenous people all around the world. But I've given you a very Aboriginal perspective of COVID-19 in these lands now called Australia. Where Australia is at today, we are talking about basically the facing of a second wave, but I guess being a very large island, it has been very well contained and managed. And so, I think we have done well in comparison to the rest of the world, but still we are yet to see what happens. I think sadly, at the moment, there's a lot of politics being played out between the states and territories and with the federal government. We have lost lives to COVID-19. Churches were one of the first things to be closed down and are still closed down, whereas many other areas have started to open up. Churches are still quite restricted. But there's been some good things around community, more people using Zoom, and computers and online and so forth. But that does create a problem as well, because it highlights where there is inequality. And I know many Aboriginal families who do not have computers, who cannot afford to get internet connected. I think Australia has some of the highest cost internet in the world and some of the poorest quality of internet as well. So we've been struggling with that. But that's kind of our picture.
Wow, that's a really, really broad picture that you've painted, and in depth, and especially your telling of the history of the Indigenous and Aboriginal population. I wanted to just hear if you have felt that because of this intergenerational memory and the fact that Aboriginal people can bring in this sort of experienced wisdom from the past lockdowns, from the past pandemics and disease that they've experienced, has the rest of Australia been more receptive to understand the injustices you faced in this time and to learn from your communities?
One of the things that I've been saying is that I'm praying for Australia to stay awake. So it feels like we've had this wake-up moment, but I think sadly a lot of Australians have gone back to sleep. So they're still awake to COVID, but everyone's still kind of people are still taking risks that cause other people with chronic health conditions to be at risk. And so we still haven't fully understood, I think, how to care for each other and care for each other deeply and to wake up to injustice. So those of us that live injustice each and every day, COVID-19 really doesn't change things. And so we still need people to love their Aboriginal neighbour or any of our other neighbours who are facing injustice. Australia has a terrible policy on asylum seekers and refugees, and many asylum seekers have been locked up in onshore and offshore detention for over 7 years. And so we've been calling for that's too long. And particularly in a COVID-19 world, government had wanted to remove mobile phones from asylum seekers in detention, and we've had to take action. And thankfully, it looks like that legislation will not go through. But a mobile phone is like a key lifeline to stay connected during these times of COVID-19, where you are isolated from people. And so there's still so much to learn and do, and many people are probably familiar it was actually the end of last year that it started, but the beginning of this year, Australia faced the worst bushfires that we have ever seen on record. And we know that they were the worst bushfires because you have Aboriginal sacred sites that are thousands of years old that were incinerated. So that's the first time they've ever burned. And we seem to Australia seemed to forget about that and move on. Those communities impacted by those bushfires have not forgotten and are still dealing with the consequences of that. And we're starting to head into summer again. And whilst it's La Nina, where the wet season is supposed to come, the bushfires have already started. So just a few weeks ago, we've had bushfire in far north Queensland. Far north Queensland is tropical rainforest. It's not supposed to burn. And so we still need to stay awake and to take action and to look outside ourselves. And so that's my fear, that we continue to just look after ourselves and our patch and not think about our community, our nation, and our world.
Yeah, that's great to hear that it has been an awakening moment, and I will pray with you all that it continues that way. I feel like the world is in that experience, and that's a good transition into what is my next question, which is, how do you think COVID-19 is impacting our understanding of mission and theology? What are the implications that we should be realizing?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because I think things have changed in the mission and theology kind of experiences in these lands now called Australia. I guess in terms of theology, with so much going online, and I mean, I'm grateful for Common Grace, which started as an online movement and very much has an online digital presence. And so people are looking at the theologians who are pursuing Jesus and justice, and also looking to theologians around the world. But I guess there can be pros and cons of those. So I feel like more people are tuning into theologians who are pursuing justice and how to do mission differently. I mean, every church in Australia has had to reconsider how to do mission, how to do community. And this is something I've been calling for a little while. I did a lecture in 2018, the annual Tinsley lecture at Moreland College, called Reclaiming Community, Aboriginal Wisdom, Mission and the Church. Because even for us, mission is, it's a hard word. My people were put on missions. Some of our people were beaten if they spoke Aboriginal language, put in chains on the missions, marched kilometres in hot sun, and Australia still hasn't reconciled with that past. And so I guess that leads me to another thing that's a little bit Australia specific in the relationship between non-Indigenous Australia and with Aboriginal peoples, and particularly in the church. So today in Australia, most Aboriginal peoples are Christian. So according to the last census, 54% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people identify as Christian, which is pretty much equivalent to the non-Indigenous population at 55%. And I think that's a little bit unique in terms of around the world. But when you look in Australian churches, you won't actually find many Aboriginal peoples, and our churches are being closed down by the denominations. We're often given the leftover buildings. So there's a large gap in equality amongst the Australian church with Aboriginal Christian leaders and Aboriginal Christians and Aboriginal ministry. And so one thing I've always said about mission in Australia is when people want to do something Aboriginal, they usually want to come and evangelize the Aboriginal peoples. And so I say we're the most over-evangelized group of peoples in the world. And I guess it goes back to that previous point where I'm praying for Australia to stay awake. Part of that staying awake is understanding that Creator God placed us here as custodians. And through all those impacts of colonization, which should have seen like it is a miracle Aboriginal people survived. And we are still here, and we're still here for a reason. But we need our leadership to be embraced and people to understand not just the inequality and inequity and injustice that we face, but to see our resilience, our adaptability, our strength, our courage, and our hope, and that we are still seeking relationship. And so this Australian specific thing that I was particularly about to talk about is this word reconciliation. It's capital R reconciliation, which is the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in these lands now called Australia. And the church was starting to get re-engaged with that journey. But I feel with COVID-19, the church turned in on itself. And so I feel like reconciliation as a movement has actually gone backwards. And it won't be until people start to come out of COVID-19, out of that fog, to see more clearly, that we'll know exactly where we're at. So my gut feeling is that we've gone backwards. So the relationships that have been forged, particularly over the last decade, potentially has gone backwards. So how do we keep going to building the relationship and doing the unfinished business that Australia still has to do, which on a national scale is we are still the only Commonwealth nation and one of the last liberal democracies without a treaty or treaties with Indigenous peoples. Our constitution still has racist clauses. There's a section in Australia's constitution that still says any state can ban any race of peoples from voting. And so and we've called for a national truth-telling commission. And so, and how Aboriginal people's voices in Parliament are heard. And so Australia still, whether it's the bushfires or COVID-19, hasn't still fully looked to Aboriginal leadership. And I believe that that's a significant call from God on these lands now called Australia. And so I'm praying for people to stay awake, but also to wake up, to listen, and to look at how we build that shared future together. And that's an Australia that I dream of, one that is built on truth, justice, love, and hope.
Thanks, Brooke. And I think one of the things that you as Common Grace seek to do and do really well is what I understand, centering Aboriginal voices and mission and theology. Has any of that become harder or easier for you during this time of COVID? And do you think that those messages of who God is from the perspective and the narratives of Aboriginal people are falling differently on this now COVID-19 ravaged world?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting time for Common Grace, and I think people are looking at us, both Christian and non-Christian, about centering those Aboriginal voices, amplifying those Aboriginal voices, but that we are actually led by Aboriginal Christian leaders specifically and Aboriginal peoples. And that's been from the very foundation of Common Grace. So we're now 6 years old as a movement, but those people that were there at the very beginning said, we cannot be a movement in these lands now called Australia without relationship with Aboriginal peoples, without including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander justice as part of the core business, and without being led by Aboriginal peoples. And so I think Common Grace, I'm actually the very first, so as an Aboriginal CEO, it's the very first time in Australia, this year 2020, I started in February as CEO, that an Aboriginal person has been appointed as the CEO or national leader of a Christian organisation in Australia. And so that's something to be celebrated. But I also look at the other side. It took us until 2020 for any Christian organisation in Australia to appoint an Aboriginal CEO. And so that just shows you how far we still have to go. But it paves the way. And so I hope that and people are looking, both Christian and non-Christian, to Common Grace. How did we do this? Why did we do this? And I think a big part of that is we answered Jesus' call to do the unfinished business of these lands now called Australia, to respect those custodians. And it's not just Brooke Prentis. We have Bianca Manning, a young Aboriginal Christian leader. She's just come on as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Justice Officer. We have Adam Gowan, an incredible Aboriginal Christian leader who is on our board. We have Auntie Jean Phillips, the most senior Aboriginal Christian leader in Australia. We are amplifying her voice. And we actually respond as Common Grace to her call for our nation to prayer in the lead up to January 26. And January 26 symbolises the impact of that colonisation. And there's so many others. Everything we do has an Aboriginal person or a Torres Strait Islander person contributing, but leading in the space. And we just need, hopefully, whilst both Christian and non-Christians are interested in what Common Grace is doing, hopefully it's an example to the Australian church and does impact mission and theology in these lands now called Australia.
That's great. Thank you so much, Brooke. And I do have one other question I wanted to ask you before we wrap it up here. But in light of all of this, all of what's going on in Australia, what has been going on for the last 250 years, and specifically the current state living in lockdown, living in the midst of COVID-19, do you have any recommendations that you would make for listeners? And yeah, it would be great too if you could speak a little bit to the Australian audience and also to the world audience, because I think we'll have people listening from both.
Yeah, so I think for me, what's been highlighted during this time is it's so easy through COVID-19, through lockdown, through social isolation, through physical distancing, to become very insular and to look inside ourselves and look for that individual protection, that family protection. But Jesus gives us that great mandate and great call to love our neighbour as ourselves. So to continue to have Jesus walk alongside you, to open your eyes, your ears, your mind, but especially your heart, that we do have a massive capacity to love, and we need to love more readily, more deeply, and more often. It might look different how we love, but it means to stay connected. And I think to tune your ear. I often talk about, as Aboriginal peoples, we are taught from a very young age about deep listening. And it's how you listen to country, and country being all those things I said before. But that means listening to the earth and listening to each other. And my hope is that we all become custodians of country, that our planet does need us. We need to look after our planet as well. But to tune your ear to those Indigenous voices here in these lands now called Australia, but right around the world. And that's very specifically also for our brothers and sisters in the United States of America. Who are your Indigenous peoples? Who are your Indigenous theologians? I know them, but you need to get to know them as well, and to listen to your lands, your colonized lands. And through that listening, we understand the interconnectedness of all of us right across the world.
Great. Thanks so much, Brooke. It's been great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me, and prayers for everyone's health, protection, and against injustice.
Thank you again for joining us today as we talk about how COVID is affecting the church and our understanding of mission in the world.
I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the platform you prefer. If you think this could be helpful for someone you know, please share it with them. The best compliment we can receive is a referral to someone else. See you next time!